Welcome to the History of the Papacy podcast, a podcast about the history of the popes of Rome and Christian Church. Prepare yourself to step behind the ropes and leave the official tour of the story of the popes and Christianity. I am your host, Steve Guerra, and I thank you for joining me on this journey. You can find show notes, how to contact me, sign up for our mailing list, and how to support the History of the Papacy by going to our website, a2zhistorypage.com. Two great ways to support the History of the Papacy are leaving your ratings and reviews on Apple Podcasts or your podcatcher of choice. And another really great way to support the History of the Papacy is by going and joining us on Patreon at patreon.com/History of the Papacy. Your support on Patreon goes a long way to help keep the History of the Papacy sustainable for a long time in the future. There are 4 tiers of support on Patreon: Antioch, Alexandria, Constantinople, and Rome. Each of these tiers represents one of the traditional patriarchates of early Christianity. There are many great benefits to you for supporting the show on Patreon. You will receive early and advertisement-free content, bonus episodes, monthly book drawings, and most importantly, you will be included on the History of the Papacy diptychs. In traditional Christianity, the diptychs are the lists of bishops commemorated in order of their precedence. The sooner you sign up on Patreon, the higher you'll be on the lists of the History of the Papacy patrons. Now let us commemorate the Patreon patrons on the History of the Papacy diptychs. We have Roberto, Joran, William B., Brian, Christina, Sarah, William H., Augustus, Keanu, and Judy at the Alexandria level. We have Dapo, Paul, Justin, Lana, John, Steve, and Sean, all of whom are magnificent at the Constantinople level and reaching that ultimate power and prestige, that of the See of Rome. We have Peter the Great, Alex the Great, Amma the Great, Frederick the Great, and Geoffrey the Great. And with that, here is the next piece of the mosaic of the history of the popes of Rome and Christian Church. We are quickly approaching the end of this exploration of the popes during the tumultuous 1800s. We are seeing all sorts of pieces of the institution of the papacy form, evolve, and in some cases broke, and in even other cases completely solidify in the 19th century. We still have a few issues to explore, though, and one really interesting issue that will feed into starting to wrap up the medieval papacy is the situation in the Church of England. In this episode, we will explore at a high level how the Christian Church of England had such a unique position in Christianity, which led to something called the Oxford Movement and Saint and Cardinal John Newman. The Oxford Movement is fascinating in its own right, and Saint John Newman as well. And this will be a transition to the what we might call the ultimate victory of the Ultramontane Church at the Vatican Council. Today we are joined by Professor Elizabeth Huddleston. Professor Huddleston specializes in British Catholic history, focusing on Cardinal John Henry Newman. She holds a PhD in theology from the University of Dayton. Dr. Huddleston is currently working on a series of projects revolving around women's involvement in the Oxford movement. I was wondering, as a place to maybe start, is how did you get interested in John Henry Newman?
Yeah, so this goes back to my doctorate days. In my master's work, I studied Syriac Christianity, and I loved it. And but one of the difficulties was the language component with the Semitic languages, and also it began feeling kind of foreign. Myself, having grown up in the kind of English Christian, Methodist tradition. Syriac Christianity was starting to feel kind of foreign. And then one of my professors suggested that I read John Henry Newman because of his interest in the patristic writers. And I became fascinated with his work and then with his context, and just couldn't read enough. And so eventually just kept digging deeper into his theology and his life.
To start off, let's maybe talk about some of the sources. And one of the thing that got me hooked into John Henry Newman was I was reading, it's an older book published in 1891 called The Oxford Movement, 12 years from 1833 to 1845 by R.W. Church. What's maybe good and bad about this text? It's pretty close to the time period, so that always leads us into some good things and some problems.
Sure. So one of the, and there's a few different books sprinkled about this time period in the late 1800s, early 1900s, dealing with the Oxford movement. One of the positives, and one of the reasons I definitely read them myself and tell other people to read them, is they are closer to the historical record. And so what you're getting is you do get some eyewitness, testimony of things that happened in the movement itself. One book that I kind of started out with was Wilfred Ward's book on his father, William George Ward, and the Oxford movement. And there's obviously a familial connection there, but these authors knew some of the people in the Oxford movement, so they get a little bit more of a personal connection to it, as opposed to what historians today are going to do is go through archives, and you get that kind of secondary reconstruction of a historical event or historical movement, things like that. One of the difficulties actually stems also from this eyewitness account, is we know from law that eyewitness accounts are not always accurate. There's sometimes a little bit more of an emotional connection to them than what you get if you're far removed. And also, they're not looking at the sources necessarily in the same way that historians a few generations later would look at the sources. And so the eyewitness account, or being very close to the people that you're writing about, is going to be both kind of a blessing and a curse, double-edged sword, or whatever analogy you want to use for that.
You get the sense that some of the Oxford movement people, maybe this is I completely read it wrong, but I didn't get the sense that R.W. Church particularly liked John Newman.
That's very possible. It's been, admittedly, I haven't read Church's account. I'm working more from, Wilfred Ward's account, which is an interesting account in and of itself, because William George Ward was from the kind of ultramontane position, and was fought against Newman on many accounts. And then his son, Wilfred Ward, actually was very pro-Newman and incorporated a lot of Newman's work into his own work during the modernist crisis, which was a quite tumultuous time as well. And so you get kind of this interesting, needing to respect his father, but also wanting to correct some of his father's ways as well, some of the theologies. And one thing that I've noticed as I go back and read a lot of the things, the books such as William George Ward and the Oxford movement, is there are quite a few, I'll just put it this way, being in Newman scholarship, there are lots of pro Oxford movement, pro Newman. You get the sense of this very holy man, especially now that he's canonized, and or around the canonization, there's all of these there's a heavy emphasis on the holiness and the genius of the man. But if you go back and read someone like Sarah Coleridge, for instance, who is Samuel Taylor Coleridge's daughter, she's very anti-Oxford movement. And so you get a lot more varied sense of how it was received. And a lot of those voices are kind of covered up in the, in the events leading up to the canonization and, the push for Newman to be a canonized saint and a doctor of the church and things like that.
That's fascinating. Before we get too deep into the weeds with that, maybe we can set the stage of who is John Henry Newman? Where did he come from? What was his class, education, his family background?
Sure. So Newman was born, he basically is the Victorian saint. So his life expands much of the Victorian era. He was born in 1801, died in 1890. He was the eldest of 6 children. He had two brothers and 3 sisters. And when he was 7 years old in 1808, he attended the Ealing School, which was one of the premier schools for young English boys. He had his first conversion at the age of 15, and not a whole lot is written about this, and it wasn't an official conversion as we get from like Anglicanism to Roman Catholicism, but he had a more of an evangelical conversion when he was 15. 2 years later, he began Trinity College at Oxford, where he began his studies. Some of his accounts of his studies are quite anxiety-inducing. There are, 12, 14-hour days where he would just read and write continuously, and he had some fitful nights and things like that. And he did have a bit of a breakdown around the time of his exams and didn't perform as well as perhaps he could have. That said, he was in 1822 elected a fellow of Oriel College, which is one of the top positions that he could have gotten. A couple years later, he was ordained a deacon. And then the next year in 1825, was ordained an Anglican priest. He first started out at St. Clement's Church in Oxford, and then was moved a couple years later to St. Mary the Virgin Church, which at the time was also connected with Littlemore Parish. And eventually that would kind of become his home at Littlemore. In 1833, that's where we get, he took a trip to Palermo and Marseille, and that's where he wrote the Lead Kindly Light, his famous hymn that we still sing in church today. He became editor of the British Critic, and he was editor there from 1838 until 1841. And then really in 1841, that's when he published his Tract 90, which kind of led to the end of his career as an Anglican priest. And he had a few years of kind of a monastic dwelling in Littlemore, and then eventually in 1845 he would be confirmed into the Roman Catholic Church, and then from there he was incarnated and founds the Birmingham Oratory, writes the Apologia, writes on consulting the faithful in matters of doctrine. He republishes the parochial and plain sermons, which kind of baptizes them as Catholic as well, which is kind of interesting. And then he wrote his Grammar of Assent, which is one of his more philosophical books.
I didn't know much about the English church of the 19th century, and just wading into it, it's so complicated. There's liberal, evangelical, high church, broad church, low church, Calvinist, Methodist, Anglo-Catholicism. And it sounds to me like Newman moved in and out of some of those different circles before he finally converted to Catholicism.
Right. So one analogy, and I know this can be taken in a long way, but one analogy for Newman's religious positions is that he's kind of a slippery figure. Because he begins, he grows up in an evangelical household. His mother is quite evangelical and Calvinist, and then he has that first conversion at age 15, and then when after that conversion, much of his writings you can find a little bit of Calvin in them, you can find a little bit of Luther even, and then he eventually, about the time he's in Oriel, he begins his place at the Oxford movement, or he begins his participation with the Oxford movement. And with that, you see a real shift from that evangelical mentality to a more high church, liturgical, Catholic in the broad sense of the term. I mean, he never really said he was Roman Catholic, but he did often argue for the Catholicity of the Anglican Church. And this is where he would get, you would see this kind of branch theory and of seeing the Anglican Church as kind of this middle way between Roman Catholicism and Eastern evangelicalism. And it was kind of this third apostolic branch of the tree.
Steve here. We are a member of the Parthenon Podcast Network, featuring great shows like Scott Rank's History Unplugged podcast and other great podcasts. Go to parthenonpodcast.com to learn more. And here is a quick word from our sponsors. That's how I read it. And they really seem to have prided themselves that the English church in particular was this huge tent where everybody kind of got along with each other.
Right. And that was actually, the big tent was part of the problem for Newman. It's not that he didn't want everyone to be Christian. It's just he didn't want everything, every practice, every, liturgical. He didn't want every doctrine to be seen as legitimate. There were he had difficulties, for instance, with the creation of a Jerusalem bishopric, or having an Anglican bishop in Jerusalem. And part of the difficulty is if it's the Anglican Church or the church in England, then what business does it have having a bishop or a bishopric in Jerusalem? And that was a big stumbling block for him. One thing we should probably talk about is the sources themselves, about how our contemporary scholarship tends to focus on the Tractarians themselves, but that doesn't really give us a good enough picture of what the movement was. So if you wanted to ask a question.
Could you maybe explain what evangelical meant in their context?
Right. So evangelicalism back then, as far as I can tell, and I'm not an expert in evangelicalism, historical evangelicalism either, is that it's very interested in kind of this personal religion and the religion of the heart. And, it has to do with, I'm trying to think exactly how it's explained, but it's this personal liberty, personal responsibility, personal liberty, personal relationship, obviously not very liturgical, not interested in ancient sources. So a lot of the evangelicalism of this time would not have wanted to read patristic sources in the same way that maybe some evangelicals today would. So it's a little bit different in that respect. John Wesley, for instance, the Wesleys, that would be a good example of evangelicalism.
And then you really have everything to the spectrum of Anglo-Catholics, which were pretty similar to Roman Catholics. What might have been the division between them and Roman Catholics?
It has to do with a lot of it has to do with the kind of practicalities of being British. Before 1829, if you were Roman Catholic, then you couldn't hold, you couldn't have a profession in law, or you couldn't participate in the judiciary in the same way as your Anglican community. So there was a practically, liturgically, theologically, there was less space between the the Anglo Catholics and Roman Catholics, and Anglo Catholics and evangelicals. Practically, there was less space between evangelicals and Anglo Catholics as far as participation in society and how they were, how they were treated and what they could do. I know in 1829, you have this Catholic Relief Act, which made a lot of things possible for Roman Catholics. But as we know from any historical study, that just because a Relief Act was passed doesn't make any prejudice really go away. And so, it does make it possible for Catholics to participate more openly in society, but there's still lots of, anti-Catholic prejudices going on that made it difficult.
Now we move on into the tracts and the tractarians. What were these tracts all about, and what was this whole movement?
Right. So the tracts are really interesting. There's 90 tracts, or 91. 90 is the last, kind of the last hurrah for the tractarians. But a lot of them have to do with sacramental aspects of the church, baptism, baptismal regeneration. What is the church is a big question that kind of weaves its way throughout the tracts. What's the nature of the Anglican Church? How should it operate? How should, what is its relationship to the ancient church? You see that a lot in the tracts. There's a lot of kind of rehabilitation of ancient sources in the tracts. Tract 90 is Newman's kind of big tract that eventually was rejected by the Anglican Church and led to his quietening in the Oxford movement. Eventually, he would, not quite recover from that and ended up converting to Rome. But if you look at the topics of Tract 90, you get Holy Scripture and authority of the Church, justification by faith only, which I think is challenged, works before and after justification, the visible church, general councils, purgatory, pardons, images, relics, and invocation of the saints, the sacraments, transubstantiation, masses, marriage of the clergy, homilies, and then finally the Bishop of Rome. And what Newman wants to argue is that in that the 39 articles, which is kind of the bedrock foundation of what Anglican doctrine is built on, can actually be read through the lens of the Catholic Church, through a Catholic lens. And obviously this was rejected, and Newman was both silenced by his bishop, but also kind of self-silenced when these were rejected.
When did this tract come out again?
This tract was in 1841, so it's at the very end of the Oxford movement. The dating for the Oxford movement is, it usually begins with Keeble's sermon National Apostasy in 1833, but the end of the Oxford movement, sometimes it's dated 1841 with this Tract 90. Sometimes it's dated at which you see in Church's book with 1845 with Newman's conversion. So
in those 3 or 4 years between when Tract 90 came out and Newman officially becoming a Roman Catholic, going to Rome, what was that time period? What was happening in his life? What was his transition?
Yeah, so this is actually a really interesting and understudied time period. This is the time when he builds up this I would say semi-monastic community in Littlemore. He buys land, and he turns some horse stables into living quarters, and he has students, and kind of a retreatants, young men would live there, and be kind of not necessarily disciples of Newman, but in a way, and would read and study. And Littlemore itself, just geographically, is about a mile and a half to 2 miles away from Oxford City Center. So Newman would walk it, he would walk from Oxford to Littlemore and back, sometimes daily. But it is far enough away to where it's kind of out. It's away from the the intellectual life and the kind of strife that he was getting from being in Oxford City Center. So it's a bit of a retreat. The congregation itself, which he would after his track 90, he would kind of pull back his participation in the church at Littlemore. But the congregation and the of Littlemore itself was more working class. It wasn't the upper class intellectual elites that he would get in Oxford itself.
Did he think coming out with track 90 that some of these other people would come along with him, or was it a declaration of independence saying this is what I really feel now? Did he know what kind of bomb he was dropping, so to speak?
Yeah, it's unclear, at least to my reading, because on some level he had to know that it wasn't going to be received well, especially, when he's talking about transubstantiation, the Bishop of Rome. But at the same time, he does seem to think, that there was room in Anglicanism for this kind of interpretation of the 39 Articles. And so I don't think he necessarily saw it as a declaration of independence necessarily, but I do think he had some sense that it wasn't going to be received well.
One of his last texts that he comes out with is the Apologia, or the last words that he spoke as an Anglican to Anglicans. Tell us a little bit about that document and what he was trying to maybe come across with that.
Yeah, so the Apologia is a really interesting study. The Apologia, it's important to remember when it was written. It was written in 1864. So he had been Catholic for nearly 20 years when he wrote that. And he was also writing it in response to Charles Kingsley's very public exhortation of Newman. And so the Apologia, and this is something that Herchan Zoidvicht has just published a book about. And so I hope that everyone can read that. I'll have to look at the title. It's called An Evangelical Adrift. But one of the things that Newman argues against in the Apologia is, he says, he claims that his lifelong fight is with liberalism, and to some extent that's true. I mean, he does have problems with liberalism, especially in his later life, when he's writing the Apologia. But to claim that the Apologia, to claim at the time of the Apologia in 1864 that liberalism was the problem in his early life is kind of, may be a misremembering, because he actually was having a lot more problems with evangelicalism early in his Anglican life than perhaps he was with evangelicalism, or with liberalism. That said, liberalism and evangelicalism, there are tenets of it that do go hand in hand. But the Apologia is a really, it's an autobiography in the sense that it does, it's first person, but it's more of an intellectual autobiography. It wouldn't be, a spiritual biography by any stretch of the imagination. But it's a really good example of where Newman is in the 1860s as he's reflecting back on his years as an Anglican. So he has plenty of time to settle into being Catholic. So it's not reactionary in that sense, but it's a good reflection.
What was the liberalism that he was fighting against or speaking out against? Because the more I read and the more we discuss in this series about liberalism, it means many different things in many different contexts. What was the context of liberalism that Newman was speaking out against?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. The liberalism is the kind of successor to the Whig Party. The Liberal Party is anyway. And it was eventually supplanted by the Labor Party. So this gives you kind of a lay of the land, if you will. Liberalism at this time tends to be interested in kind of reform and individual freedoms, and whereas Tory conservatism, for instance, was interested more in kind of the law and order, which is different from what we think of as law and order in America. And it emphasized the kind of landed interests of people who own land, right? So it's in that context. For Newman, the religious sensibilities against liberalism of the day is going to be against that personal religion, personal, the personalized religion as opposed to this visible church. He's very interested in what the church is and how we all function within it, which is it's hierarchical and visible and has a place in our society, whereas a lot of the liberalism kind of wants to push it more to our kind of private, personal understanding of our personal experience of things like that, as opposed to what looks like more of the Catholic Church with the the Pope and the hierarchy and things like that.
Then you take Newman and you slide him over into a different context, and it sounds to me as in the arguments of the day in the Ultramontane Church, he wasn't anti-Ultramontane, but he was definitely a little bit more, I don't know if liberal is quite the right word, but he's a little more moderate on things like papal infallibility than a lot of other people were at that time.
Yeah, and I think it is safe to say that he was kind of against ultramontanism, and at least in a sense, because he and William George Ward, for instance, William George Ward is the one who famously said, "I'd like a papal bowl with my morning tea," or something like that. And Newman, on the other hand, argued, at least before Vatican I, he argued against papal infallibility. And he kind of famously didn't accept the invitation to participate at Vatican I. He kind of did the Victorian, I'm going to stay home and write, excuse, but it was because he didn't want to be part of the minority who opposed papal infallibility. That in of itself is, a very different context. Like he was at home in Catholicism, but he wasn't main, like what you would think of as mainline of the day necessarily. He was kind of a minority voice in his arguments against papal infallibility. That said, once it was passed and once it became dogma, he accepted it. He didn't fall into heresy or anything like that. In his public explanations.
Yeah, he really did seem to plow his own course through all of these
Mhm.
issues. He sure doesn't seem to be afraid to speak his mind on these
Right.
issues and take a stand.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's and at the beginning when I mentioned that he was kind of a slippery figure, one of the things that I meant when I said that is that he doesn't fit necessarily in the boxes very well, and so he had a lot of arguing and a lot of strife in the Anglican Church, and then he goes over to Rome, and he's not completely happy at all times there with how things are being run and with how doctrine is understood, and things like that. And so he's often trying to he's never just settled. He's an unsettled soul, I guess, for lack of better words.
How is John Newman understood, maybe in the generation or two after his death?
Yeah, so in the generation or two after his death, you get the I mean, there's he knows that he's going to be thought of as a saint, and one of the evidences of that, perhaps, and this is kind of a theory of mine, is when he was before he died, he told he put it in his will that he wanted to be um, sprinkled with a thin layer of soil so that he would decompose very quickly. And the reason that he did that, as best I understand it, is because he didn't want to be dug up and sectioned off and cordoned off like they do with the saints. And so I think he had some inkling anyway, that he was on the way to sainthood. And so as far as the books that are written, the accounts that are written in the generation after his death, you get a mixed bag. You get some who see him as this kind of saintly, holy figure who could do no wrong. And then you get the ones like perhaps Church, who you mentioned earlier, who maybe wasn't quite as sympathetic to Newman. In the 1890s and early 1900s, you still have a lot of anti-Catholic sentiment going on in England. And so, he is still the Anglican who got away, who converted to Rome. So that's kind of what he's seen as to some, but then those in Catholicism, a lot of people see him as a saint. What's interesting is in the context of Catholicism, in the early, kind of starting in the 1880s, continuing up until about the First World War, you get the modernist crisis. And Newman was actually one of the figures that were being read on both sides of the modernist crisis. And so you have both conservatives and liberals or you can group it that way. You have the modernists and the neo-scholastics, both of whom are reading Newman and claiming him as their own. So you can kind of see how, at least in which would be about a generation or two after his death, how he's being incorporated into Roman Catholic conversations.
Steve here again with a quick word from our sponsors. As a modern scholar of Newman, how do people discuss Newman today?
Well, he's a canonized saint now, so he's incorporated he has a feast day on the calendar. But Newman, much like in the modernist crisis, Newman is kind of used by different groups to make certain points. That's one of the negative ways that Newman's legacy. But Newman, the body of writing that Newman has is so varied that it lends itself to you have philosophers, education specialists, people who are interested in literature. He wrote novels as well. people who are interested in history, theories of history, philosophies of history, theology, both historical and systematic. So all of these different specialists are kind of trying to get together and figure out who this person is and how he can speak to our contemporary context. One example of that is, I work for the National Institute for Newman Studies, and we have a visiting scholars program here. And our visiting scholars come from all of these disciplines. We have people with PhDs in history, people with PhDs in theology, philosophy, both continental philosophy and analytic, history, the whole gambit. And they all are able to publish in the Newman Studies Journal because Newman's writings they touch on all these fields.
What's your particular interest or fascination with Newman? What are you studying right now?
Right. So my projects right now tend to focus on Newman's Anglican years. And I'm looking at the reception of the Oxford movement by women, both theologians and in literature and in literature. So some of the people that I'm looking at, I just this week was reading through Sarah Coleridge's writing, and I would not call her of the Oxford movement because she distinctly writes against the Oxford movement and has some really interesting things to say in opposition to the Oxford movement. But there are some really interesting figures such as Christina Rossetti, who's part of the Pre-Raphaelite. She's kind of not in the movement itself, the Pre-Raphaelites, but kind of adjacent to it. And then looking at how the Oxford movement was received by these women. And part of the reason for my wanting to do that is because, if we focus only on, it's important to focus on the documents themselves, but in order to look at the success of a movement, we have to look at how influential it was and how it was received at the time. Otherwise, it could just be this group of men exchanging letters and it not really getting any press or making any kind of real influential, any real imprint on the church itself. So looking at women, a lot of times, they're the ones who are kind of keeping the church running on a day-to-day basis. And so seeing how they're being influenced by this pastoral movement, I think is very important for our understanding.
Did women have a seat at the table in this movement? Did they participate and add to it a lot, or was this still patriarchal?
Yeah, it's a both and. So it is patriarchal. I wouldn't say that there are women, participating in the Oxford movement in the same way that Newman and Pusey and Keble were. At the same time, they were preachers, they were pastors, and the women were the ones who were being pastored too, and the ones who were kind of disseminating the information. So you get letters between friends. You also have at this time what are called sisterhoods. They're kind of like convents, kind of like Anglican convents that were Anglo-Catholic. And so, I'm in the process of trying to figure out what those sisterhoods were, if they had any kind of official voice in the movement itself. And even if they didn't have there wasn't necessarily an official voice, because they weren't pastors, but, what kind of influence they may have had on how well the movement can be said to have been successful.
Well, I want to thank you so much. I think you've given us so much more context and really built out Newman and somebody who played such an influential role in so many different contexts during this tumultuous time in church history and world history. If you had to make a suggestion of where somebody might go to learn more about Newman, where do you think somebody could start to wade in?
Yeah, so there are lots of sources. One would be if you go to newmanstudies.org, we have our digital collections, which has nearly all of it has all of Newman's published works, free and open to the public. His letters and diaries are all free and open to the public. You have to set up a username and password, but other than that, it's all free. And then, from there, there's a book called Newman 101 that's quite good. The Oxford Handbook of the Oxford Movement is quite good, and also the Oxford Handbook of John Henry Newman is where I usually tell people to start.
That's awesome. Thank you so much. And if there's ever a time where there's something you want to talk about Newman or your studies, you are always welcome to come back on.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for having me.